Hi, I'm Susan. I'm from Worldpeacefull, and this is part 11 in my bullying series, where I'll be looking at risk management. I'm going to read out of my report called Psychological Abuse and Disputes, and I'm going to firstly focus on risk management from Comcare. Before I do, this notion of risk is very interesting, and of course it's emerged from the factory floor, from the world of people being injured physically in workplaces, typically in manufacturing sector was where it really started, and the mining sector, where people were injured on the job, just through not concentrating, or perhaps there was faulty equipment, perhaps people weren't mindful, when there were spills, and with spills comes slippages. There have been many cases of people who have been using equipment to saw and lost a hand, or maybe their hand got caught up in machinery. Some have died on the job. So the risk management field, if you like, has emerged from physical risk to human life. Of course, the psychological, social emotional area is not well understood at this time, as it's been largely ignored from the beginning of really the industrial era. It's only now starting to surface because of the issue of bullying, and people are taking their lives. It's extremely important that this subject's understood. But before we look at the emotional side of it, let's look at Comcare's assessment of risk management. So under section 16(2)(ai) of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, employers are required to provide an environment that is safe for the employer's employees and without risk to their health. In addition, Section 1 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, or Regulations 1994, and Part 1 of the Occupational Health and Safety Code 2008 provide practical guidance for employers to assist them to identify hazards, assess the risk, and implement risk control measures in the workplace. To ensure you meet your duty of care, you should apply a systematic risk management approach that is regular and ongoing. You can adapt existing risk management methodologies used in OH&S to fit the nature of psychosocial hazards. I'm actually spending a little moment here contemplating that. I don't know if that's true. Nonetheless, I'll read on. Risk management is important as it may identify particular problem areas in your organisation, focus on potential effects of changes, and ensure new issues are noticed. So it's very much about seeing, isn't it? Seeing the potential for a problem and taking steps to ensure that problem doesn't happen. So preventative safety. For monitoring and evaluation purposes, this information can be useful to feed back into reviews of your organisation's policies and procedures. So in effect, are they working in a practical sense? A key element of the risk management model is senior management leadership and commitment. For an occupational health and safety risk management strategy to be successful in an agency, it must be driven by senior management. This is the level of management responsible for making critical decisions in terms of organisational values, priorities, and future decisions. Risk management is most effective when it is integrated into the initial stages of business and strategic planning. So it's very important for managers at all levels, really, to be conscious of risk management, and to ensure the safety. If we flip it to the other side, this is really about creating a safe space for people to work. So what's happening here in this type of structure, this type of model, is they're looking for the risk. It's an interesting approach. I have some other ideas on ways to minimise problems and maximise solutions, but I'll come to that. It should be noted that the Australian Public Service legislation places an emphasis on high levels of professional leadership and expertise, and performance management and accountability in a devolved management framework. So that's really delegating, to various people within the organisation. Devolved management framework, this has typically been found in hierarchical structures. They are, structured. Devolving management is really spreading it out and making more people accountable. So it's not just a few at the top, but everybody's actually accountable for health and safety. These principles are just as appropriate to organisations not covered by the Commonwealth Public Service Act here in Australia. As part of the legislative requirements, Section 16(1) of the Occupational Health and Safety in brackets Commonwealth Employment Act 1991, the OH&S Act, states that an employer must take all reasonably practicable steps to protect the health and safety at work of the employer's employees. Senior management is in the best position to demonstrate its commitment to and provide leadership in the development and implementation of occupational health and safety risk management programs to meet legislative requirements. Actively involved and accountable senior managers who drive health and safety activities are more likely to deliver successful organisational health and safety outcomes. Well, that's the tone of that written work is fairly, legal and sort of prescriptive of risk management. And it's obviously effective when senior managers are accountable, and they're not always accountable. The thing with profit motive and the various competing pressures that management go through, they have a lot of demands on their time. These days too, more and more, including, statutory authorities, organisations that were government funded are now becoming, increasingly independent, where there's some government oversight, but predominantly they will have a mixture of business now on their boards. So that whole business ethos is creeping into public service, or organisations that have been deemed a public good is what we'd call it in economics. Education, health, defence, all these taxation tends to fund these public goods. So they're typically public goods because they service the public. Things that, typically would have been, ineffective cost-wise for the private sector to actually pick up. Your telecoms typically are a good example of that, even though we have corporatised and moving towards privatisation of telecoms. The reason why the private sector wasn't that interested is because there were rural areas that would have needed a lot of cabling. It would have been very expensive. It needs to be cross-subsidised by the cities. And unless a multinational can see real profits coming out of that, they're not going to do it. So government, typically through taxation, through GSTs and various other forms of income, have picked up those public services, such as the post office. We're seeing it with the post office as it corporatises. and again has more of a private orientation, the cost of post is going up, and of course the competition there is emails. People are emailing rather than posting letters, so they would have had a massive drop in profit. So the reason I'm sort of covering this aspect of governance and management is because these pressures up at the upper levels and a changing dynamic environment tends to take their eyes off leadership and probably more focused on more practical management tasks. And their reputations are now becoming more and more important, which means they don't want people speaking up. So the whole democratic focus is becoming suppressed. And of course, risk management in terms of psychosocial issues are to do with psychological matters where people may feel repressed in hierarchical structures, not feeling that they're heard. They might be getting bullied because there's pressures, in respect of productivity. There's also a lot of changes and restructuring. We've had, decades of restructuring of businesses where we've seen huge cuts and a lot of people lose their jobs. So things like sabotage can be problematic if people seek revenge. The idea of risk management is really an internal policing, in my view. Does that protect health and safety? In terms of physical safety, yes, you can reduce risk. You can look at hazards and you can minimise those. You can prioritise those to make sure that those that are of higher priority are really receiving a lot of resources to curtail. But really the psychological risk stuff is, as I said, a new area, and it's can be competing with the pressures around management and the authoritarian nature of management. We're not typically dealing in democratic structures here, so because they're becoming increasingly privatised, they're becoming more private, which means not open to public scrutiny. They can make a lot of decisions behind closed doors. They can be less accountable. If a certain personality type is very controlling, then you can have very authoritarian management. And they may not have an accountability because of what they might deem as being more practical. They may cut corners, and not adhere to OH&S, but no one will really know if nobody talks about it. So that's one aspect. Now I'm going to move to risk management or managing risk. Now it's come from David Smith, who is an employee of WorkCover. So it's still in insurance of injuries. So they're very interested in preventing injury, psychological as well as physical. So David Smith, he examines these issues and provides an organisational risk management growth model as an answer to these questions. Excerpts are extracted to illustrate managing risk with a focus on the emotions. Recent history is littered with companies that have had excellent risk management structures and yet have fallen prey or have been exposed to huge losses as a result of a failure to manage risk. What causes this? Why do good risk management structures and robust processes fail to deliver results? The aftermath of September 11 highlighted how emotions affect people's response to risk. Research has compared the effects on workers close to the site, as similar to how refugees respond, has demonstrated the effect that anger and fear can have on risk judgments, and contends that people assets can only be harnessed by managing both intellectual capital, in brackets your people's knowledge, and emotional capital, the feelings, thoughts, and emotions of your people. How can we engage those emotions so that we can move from a process, and he's got in brackets head, to a preference, and he's got in brackets heart? response? And more importantly, how can we have a practical and positive impact on our organisation's risk management culture? In most organisations, the only time that sociological risk is taken into account is when dealing with reputational risk. As sociological risk is about what society thinks we have an external focus when dealing with it. This external focus is what Thompson calls external emotional capital, and what is often described as brand value or goodwill, and is being seen by more and more companies as a core part of their asset base. We often forget that there is internal emotional capital, which is held in the hearts of the people within the business. Thompson describes this internal emotional capital as the feelings, beliefs, and values held by everyone in the business. Just as emotions impact upon the community's understanding of risk, it will also impact upon the internal risk perceptions of our staff. As such, we cannot ignore the values and beliefs of our staff. Managers are very interested in keeping their own risks under control and are not interested in risks that they see as the responsibility of others. The result can be an heightened perception of risk, as they are considering only the impact on themselves within their own narrow context. Or it can underestimate a risk by not considering interdependencies or the impact on other areas of the business. Emotional theory has its roots in many disciplines, which can roughly be broken into four broad perspectives. A biological approach based on Darwinian view that our emotions are hardwired responses which stem from the prehistoric past. A psychodynamic Freudian model that views emotions as deeply rooted in our early childhood experiences. A cognitive approach which believes that our emotions have no psychological meaning in themselves, unless we are able to make sense of what we see or hear. In other words, they need to be understood within the context or event that they occur within. A social approach that sees the culture within which the emotion or emotions occurs as all important. Whilst it is true that academic libraries are full of learned discussions arguing the relevant merits of each perspective, risk managers need to have some understanding of them all if they hope to engage staff at all levels of their organisation. Why is all of this important? Firstly, risk managers need to understand that the feelings and emotions people are experiencing at any given time will affect their perception of risk. How often do we see people engaged in risk management processes because it is seen as a compulsory activity? They have no real interest and no real understanding of how it can be integrated into the way they carry out their business. The head and the heart are both not engaged. This is not their fault. It stems from the biological perspective and 300 years of human thought. Descartes introduced the notion of dualism of mind and body in the 17th century. In everyday thinking, we see this playing out as athletes are prepared both mentally and physically. And in quotes, it's all in your mind, is common parlance. A tendency to treat the mind as the body's boss, and there is seen to be no place for emotion in the work environment. In 1872, Darwin's paradigm-shifting work, The Origin of Species, reinforced the denigration of emotions when he viewed them as remnants from 300 million years ago. where they were necessary for the survival of our species. We need to understand how this fight-flight mentality has been hardwired for our survival, can affect people by making them belligerent or withdrawn in the workplace. But we must not limit ourselves to a perspective that denigrates emotions and ignores the softer people aspects, as this will derail the implementation of enterprise-wide risk management practices and doom them to failure. More recently, the groundbreaking work of leading neurologist Antonio Damasio found that, in quotes, the emotional centers of the brain are integral to thinking and reasoning, end quote. Despite having fully functioning cognitive faculties, patients with just the emotional centers of the brain damaged through trauma were unable to think, reason, and function in society. Emotions are linked to the way people think and to their perceptions of risk. Key points from David Smith's PowerPoint presentation. He asks, why is moving from the head to the heart understanding of the risk preferred? Because if you don't, you'll be stuck in a compliance policing model. Something to really contemplate if we're serious about reducing risk. An example is used of George Costanza's attitude from Seinfeld. David states George's view is not uncommon. Doing something because he has to is the first point. No real interest, no understanding of how it can be integrated into the way he does business. The head and the heart are both not engaged, but this is not his fault. It stems from 300 years of human thought. His advice is, ignoring risks do not make them go away. So that's really interesting. That section I just read out, you can feel the different tone from the previous one, which was a more prescriptive one. This is getting more to the heart of the psychosocial issues, the emotions. And I really thought it was a very powerful point about how emotions are kind of not seen as relevant in the workplace. And I've definitely heard people say that, if you want to be happy, don't go to work. Things like love, and I'm not talking romantic love here, are not in the workplace, not meant to be. So who we are as human beings is like truncated to some degree, whereas we're only there to perform in a certain way. And we're doing this for most of our working lives. You're at work. So your emotional side of your life is pretty much put to the side. You leave it at the door as you come in, would be the way I would see it. And if you show displays of emotions at work, people don't like it. They see it as unprofessional. They see you as highly emotional. Whereas what typically people want to be soothed by is the cold, cool, rational decision maker who doesn't get flustered, who knows what to do. It's almost like that fatherly type, who takes control and everyone feels more secure. But who we are as human beings is very much not encouraged. So we suppress that emotional part of ourselves at work. But the thing with psychological suppression is that it has countervailing impacts. People get frustrated, people get overstressed. People suppress that emotion to the point where it can start to go into the unconscious. You can start to develop unconscious behaviours you're not even aware of that may affect others. And people might start drinking more alcohol. People might take antidepressants to try not to face their own sadness at work because they've got to be seen to be. And it's this sort of scaffolding that we create in workplaces, and it's detrimental to psychological health and well-being, or health and safety. And it's something typically men have not been very good at understanding as the psychological or the emotional landscape. Women typically have a fairly tuned in perception of it. for all our lives. We're allowed by society to feel our feelings. If you're a female, well, she's crying. There are disparaging comments about women crying, but it's pretty much accepted. If a man cries, it's a whole different ballgame. And my hope would be that more and more men would find compassion for men who express their feelings. The more gentler the men, they tend to be isolated somewhat by their contemporaries. I've seen a lot of isolated gentlemen because they're not seen as robust and what would be perceived generally as strong. And yet that whole idea of strength has to be turned upside down. The real strength is actually in the gentleness, and that's how you really minimize risk, because if people are treating each other with respect and compassion, the psychological risks will diminish. If you have a very supportive workplace, everything changes. So I thought I'd just give a little bit of an overview of the risk management from a couple of perspectives. In my next section, which I'll record, I'm going to look at healthy and unhealthy environments, which will pick up on some of the points that have just been mentioned in this video. So thank you very much for listening. The next section will be also looking at risk management, but we're looking more at toxic and healthy cultures. So stay tuned. Thank you. Bye.